Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Hughes. I'm co-chair of the Ethics Committee and a faculty member in the Berman Institute of Bioethics. Welcome to the December installment of Ethics for Lunch, and season's greetings to everyone. Today we're going to be talking about spiritual distress and the role of the chaplain in helping people with suffering, both patients and families in that. Just to let you know, I think some of you have been to Ethics for Lunch before, but this is a forum that we present monthly to discuss issues that are pertinent to the hospital community. So we welcome your input. Hopefully there'll be some time for discussion today and get your feedback about this particular issue. And then hopefully you can attend the third Tuesday of every month when we have Ethics for Lunch. Just to remind you, if you do want continuing education credit, if you text this code to that particular phone number, then you will get credit that's logged in with the CME office. I'm going to turn it over to Ty Crowe, who is the director of our Department of Spiritual Care and Chaplaincy, and he'll introduce our panel today.
All right, well, thank you, Mark, and happy holidays to everybody in the various ways you celebrate. We tend to, in spiritual care, be connected to this month of December, and this may be an annual event that we do each December. Can everybody hear me in the back? No? Speak a little louder. How about now? Better? Much better? Well, I also want to make mention that even though we say happy holidays in most inclusive ways, I'm sure, the holidays can also be a difficult time. I think we can acknowledge that, certainly. It's not just because we need to have additional time with family members that we'd rather not connect with for a day or even a few days. It's also a time that people do struggle. And I think it's important to highlight that, because when you have a significant loss, we say this in thinking and even in theory, that the holiday time can really accentuate and heighten your grief. And there may be people in this room right now who are not looking forward to the holidays. And if not, then I'm sure you know of people who are not looking forward to the holidays. So in that spirit, I think we want to be able to hold both the celebration, but also the potential for something that may be just beneath the surface, which is what we in spiritual care tend to focus in on. What might be just hovering underneath the surface here in someone's story. So we're focusing obviously this time in spiritual care and how our services interplay in support of overall treatment teams, patients and families, and also in support of medical teams. And in ethics, we often find that medical teams are experiencing some degree of distress. And that's sort of on par with sort of normal functioning. There's a certain level of distress. And it can come in various forms: emotional, moral, and spiritual, often pushed to their limits when patients' wishes are in conflict, sometimes direct conflict with the medical team's hopes for care. The emotional toll then sits in one hand, but the spiritual toll can also sit on the other. So I want to spend a minute here and say something about spiritual distress. How many of you have heard that as two words together? Not very many. So this may be new material. Spiritual distress. Spiritual distress is actually defined as a risk factor. It's a risk factor. And you're looking at the possibility of a person feeling extremely disconnected. There's a disconnection or a type of break with harmony. That harmony of feeling connected with life, with the universe, with God, however you may define a supreme being, or something transcendent beyond yourself. This disconnect has the power to disrupt the sense of self many of us come to sort of rely on. A person experiencing spiritual distress may express concern with the meaning of life and death, question the meaning of suffering of his or her own or somebody else's. They may verbalize inner conflict about their beliefs and or express anger or sadness toward God or universe, life, however you would define that. transcendent being. So you can see, probably for all of us, from one time or another, we've experienced some degree of disconnection, some degree of disruption to what we believe or what we have our faith in. Having spiritual distress does not mean that someone has a weak faith. I'll say that again. Having spiritual distress does not mean that someone has a weak faith. In fact, it could mean the opposite. That those who can acknowledge their inner feelings and the impact of their questioning and concerns, those folks often have the opportunity to deepen their faith as a result. And that's something that I personally believe. I personally believe that going through spiritual distress is an opportunity to be transformed. Yet, I do believe also, regretfully, many of us are unable to endure and are at risk for increased disconnection and isolation. So even in chaplaincy, and you all rely upon the faith of your chaplain, which is a good thing, but to pull the veil out just a little bit, even chaplains have to struggle. This work that we do is unique. There's a ministry and a hospital that is unique to the institutions in which we serve. This is not a traditional congregation. This is not a house of worship. This is a different place where we recognize and have to highlight the work of spiritual care. Preliminary data suggests from our chaplain training program that our students have to work hard to have their theologies adapt to the real-life circumstances and the real people they encounter every day. We put together a training program called Clinical Pastoral Education, and in that training program, we'll put together a wonderful syllabus, all types of wonderful learning that our students will go through in a small group process. And then you have the ministry, so the actual experience of ministry to people, finding yourself in situations, and then having to come back and reflect on it with peers. That's what we call the hidden curriculum. They also have to work to promote new ways to take care of themselves and find reliable, trusting peers to confide in. This is not necessarily only confined to chaplains. Often the best chaplains are the ones that are in some form of ongoing psychotherapy themselves, so as to find deeper levels of resilience and to understand themselves as they do this unique ministry. A few words about our chaplain training program. So clinical pastoral education has been at Johns Hopkins Hospital now. This is going to be our 15th year. And we became a system for our academic division 5 years ago. The program is directed by Reverend Chris Brown. I don't think he's here. He's also the director of our community chaplaincy program for the health system. Each year we're training 45 approximately students, residents, interns, and supervisory students. Interns typically are part-time. Local clergy offer about 10 hours per week in our hospital. Residents have made the dome their second home, as we say. Residents, if you're here, raise your hand. Yeah, you've made the dome your second home, Jackie, right? Yeah. It's competitive. Those students come from around the country, and our supervisory students are investing 3 to 4 years as they develop the art of supervisory training to facilitate future training groups, produce publishable theory, and demonstrate integration of theory and practice on a national level, become certified educators. We're fortunate to have 2 of these individuals on our panel today, Reverend Brittany Powell, who also doubles as the chaplain for our case, and Reverend Randy McMurray. I want to highlight here that the original flyer that went out did not include either Randy or Brittany's credentials. The revised one that you should have in front of you does include their credentials. And I'll highlight, since I see in the audience Josh Rodriguez-Hobbs and Asia Johnson, who are also in the supervisory education track for our department. All right, so our relatively small group of chaplains that we have in our department, they function, they thrive, I hope, alongside our various students in our program, and part of their ministry is also to our students. in addition to the professional chaplaincy work that they do in their clinical areas. Today we're joined by Reverend Matt Norvell, chaplain for the Blue Parks Children's Center, and we're also joined by our Hopkins Ethics Committee co-chair, faculty member, School of Nursing, who needs really no introduction here, Dr. Sandra Rushton. And I will put a plug in for her book that she's writing, Moral Resilience, an Antidote to Moral Suffering, coming soon to bookstores around the country. So before we jump straight to the case here, I want to look at our objectives here to identify 4 forms of suffering that arise in clinical practice, to understand the range of ways that spiritual values influence and are expressed by patients or their families, to understand the role and expertise of chaplains in the care of seriously ill and dying patients, and to apply specific strategies and resources to complex clinical cases that involve various forms of suffering. All right, so we have our panelists. So I'm going to read aloud the case, and then we'll hand it over to our panel to get our discussion going. All right, so the case. The patient's a 54-year-old African-American male, past history of asthma, hepatitis C, HIV, polysubstance abuse. He was admitted at Johns Hopkins Hospital, presenting the emergency department via EMS as a pedestrian was struck by a motor vehicle. The patient was transferred to the NCCU for further treatment, management of an extensive bilateral subdural hemorrhage, bilateral subarachnoid hemorrhage, diffuse anoxal injury, and skull fractures. The chaplain was consulted to provide emotional and spiritual support during a family meeting, which was convened to discuss a family dispute over power of attorney between the patient's oldest sister and the patient's daughter. The medical team reported the patient's aunt represented herself as the patient's power of attorney. The patient's not married and has one adult daughter. The patient was unable to speak, did not have a healthcare agent named in an advance directive, nor did he have a healthcare power of attorney. During the family meeting, it was determined that the daughter of the patient was the legally authorized decision maker. The chaplain's first encounter with the patient's daughter was after a family meeting. The chaplain assessed the daughter to be Christian, a Baptist, in her 30s, and reportedly had just reestablished a relationship with her father. The ethics team was called when the patient's health was deteriorating and there had been an unhelpful encounter with the patient's daughter. The patient's daughter had not come to the hospital for a few days, so the attending physician had called her on the phone. In the phone conversation, the attending physician encouraged the patient's daughter to change the code status of her father. This conversation did not have the outcome desired, and so the chaplain was called to intervene. Later that day, the chaplain was able to reach the patient's daughter by phone. The chaplain listened to her story of mistrust, of feeling pressured to, quote, pull the plug, and also the stressors involved in decision-making from the situation and from her own family. The patient's daughter also shared her grief about losing her father after he had recently found sobriety. The chaplain was able to listen, her feelings, and encourage her to reflect on her own faith about the situation. During the conversation, the chaplain also apologized for the pressure she felt from the earlier conversation that created distress. At the conclusion of the day, the patient's daughter came to the hospital and changed her father's code status to DNR denied. So at this time, I'd like to hand it over to our 4 panelists, and I believe Brittany Howe had agreed to lead off.
I would like to first start off by saying thank you to Ty, and thank you for being a part of this panel, and thank you all for actually choosing this case in which I have the privilege to be a part of. And I'm a Baptist preacher. And so not only am I a Baptist minister, I have an immersion into African spirituality. So I would like to pause for a moment to thank the ancestors that have come before me and in this sacred institution. And I call them their names, such as Vivian Thomas and King Elect, who I have the privilege of sitting in the Blaylock building where my office is near Vivian Thomas' picture. And so in knowing the history of this institution, which Dr. Vivian Thomas did not have the ability to share his work, but we are writing this room today by allowing me to share my work in this space. So I would like to thank you and pause for that in his honor and his legacy. So let's get to the case, and let's talk about the particular pastoral conversation that was brought up. And so in this particular case, I was able to establish what I would call a connection. And I was able to establish a connection with this particular patient family member. One, through my own narrative, as I am an African American woman who is a daughter, oldest daughter to my father, who also had substance abuse. And the patient family member in this particular case was also a daughter to his father, who also dealt with substance abuse. So in that particular narrative, I was able to join with her and to empathize with her and connect with her through my own story. So Ed Wimberly, who is a professor of pastoral care, he states that in his book, Calling of the Narratives, is that a caregiver or a pastoral care professional cannot actually give care without some information from their own narrative. So I was able to particularly speak to this particular family member through my own narrative. So I used that narrative as an arsenal, I would say. Used it as my tool to actually provide care for this particular family member. The second thing that needs to be noted is that another tool that a chaplain has is called the spiritual assessment. We all come with our own particular assessment to assess the particular case. And so in this particular case, and as an educator, one of our goals in the pastoral care department is that we start off with the FICA tool, which was actually created by Dr. Pukowski. He created this tool to actually assess the spiritual need of the particular patient or a family member. And in the FICA tool, you have what is called, it's an acronym, and the F stands for faith, the I stands for the importance of the faith community, or what is the important need of this particular patient or family member. The C stands for what is the community? Does the patient family member has a community, a faith community that will support them in their time of suffering or illness? And then the A is what is it that all the data that we just collected from this particular patient, how will it address the plan of care? And so in this particular, so all of the things are what's actually I'm using to kind of assess what's going on with this particular family member. However, I have my own tool, and what my form of practice is called SACRED. It's called, it's an acronym which I created, Seeking Authentic Conversations Religiously Every Day. So every day, my practice of spiritual care is really coming in and inviting the patient and the family member to share their story with me. Share with me why you're here. And through sharing their narrative is how I come to find out what is the spiritual distress, what is the chief lament, what is the heart of the matter of the particular patient and family member in this case. And so basically with this particular family member, what she specifically shared as I was listening to her share her story was the connection with the will of God. What is the will of God? What should the will of God, what will God have me do as it concerns my father's care? Should I pull the plug? And if I pull the plug, is that me taking the will of God? Is that taking the power out of God's hand? So she was concerned that she would be actually taking the power out of God's hand if she made that decision. And through conversation, what Spirit would have me to tell her in that encounter is that actually we don't get to discern when our parents, when our loved ones die, when we die. We don't have that definite definition. We don't get to decide that. But we can decide how people die. And somehow in that encounter, it changed the tone of the encounter. It changed her interaction with the attendee. It changed her interaction, and it provided some sense of hope and comfort to her, that knowing that we don't have the power, as the physician doesn't have the power to decide whether or not her father will die, but we can decide how he will die. And through that conversation, she made the change to make the decision. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Brandy McMurray. So in reading this case, what came to mind for me was spiritual distress, just to point out where the spiritual distress lied for me as I'm reading through this case. And just as Britt has just noted, the patient's daughter was having thoughts or theological wrestlings about pulling the plug. And so what does that mean for her theologically? And so that creates a spiritual distress. It creates spiritual distress. And we still have to remember that patients and families and staff as chaplains, that everyone in this situation is grieving. And so if you know anything about Kubler-Ross and their stages of grief, the first stage of grief is denial. And so at first, you experience that with patients where they're in a space of denial. They just don't believe what has been the prognosis or the diagnosis or what is coming. And so they go against everything that you're trying to tell them, everything that's needed to happen for the patient. And then they move right into anger, right? And so then you have a lot of patients, or even the daughter, expressing her anger. And I don't think, sometimes we're unable to note that this is a cycle. So as people are going through grief and people are going through this is the first time that they're dealing with it. And as clinicians, this is not the first time that we're dealing with it. But if we're able to put ourselves in the position to where we understand that this is the first time they may be experiencing any type of loss of relationship, loss of self, loss of their normal. Now they have to grieve their old way of being. A lot of people grieve being independent. And so if we keep that in mind as we're offering ministry to patients, and as we immerse ourselves into the family and actually hear what they're saying in the moment. And I understand that as clinicians, we often have to put on a numbness so that we aren't affected every day. But just imagine you're receiving the news that your father is about to die, and you haven't had a relationship with your father. And then the doctor is suggesting that you pull the plug. So that's a loss of relationship with her father. She doesn't know what God's will is. And so all of this grief, all of this combined grief, all of this convoluted grief almost gets put on us as clinicians, right? So we have to hold their grief. My supervisor has this example of a bowl. And so when you're with patients and they're grieving, you have a bowl between the two of you. And so instead of you taking on all of their stuff, you're able to put their stuff in the bowl. You're experiencing grief as well because this is another patient that you possibly might lose. And so you're putting your grief in the bowl. And then all of you are grieving together. Now so then chaplains are not only called in just for patients and just for families, but we support you as well. We are integrated into the staff, into the unit, so that we can offer spiritual comfort to you and emotional comfort, just support you in any way. So I think what I needed to highlight today was that we're all grieving. If a patient is lost, they're losing more than just the patient. They're losing the relationship, the future, whatever they thought the future was going to be. And we just need to keep that in mind as we're offering care and support to our patients and families.
So part of our intention of having 3 chaplains with kind of at 3 different points along in their training, then having our subversive, non-named chaplain who goes and chaplains people without them knowing it, is to be able to think about and offer some insight into what it is that goes on inside of us as we show up to different situations. And the thing that I'm struck by is this, on the flyer, the question, the third one, of what role do chaplains play in supporting medical decisions? And some of you have probably experienced a situation like this case where whether it was the chaplain or the social worker or somebody was sent because the physician had a hard time getting the family to agree to their plan. And so we send, I see some headlines, that's good. we get sent. The chaplain, the social worker, sometimes the child life specialist. Why don't you go out there and see if you can get them to agree to this? And in my experience, most of the time, where there's a conflict, it's often it's not just miscommunication, it's communication that's missing each other. Right? And it goes along with what both Randy and Brittany mentioned. It's being able to appropriately assess somebody and where they are and what their experience is. This woman, I don't know, I was not a part of this case, but the physician likely said something like stopping life-sustaining treatment or withdrawing life-sustaining treatments. And she may not have had any idea what that means. But then they got translated to pull the plug, which has a lot of emotion built into that. And a lot of agency built into that on her part, a lot of responsibility built into that on her part. And we don't know what that meant for her in just the first level 1 or 2 hour conversation between a physician and a woman who is reunited with a father that she's not had much relationship. She was on the front end of being able to process all this stuff. And I don't think anybody here is inappropriately doing it, but we expect people to quickly jump on board with understanding our decision-making tree and our timeline and the way an ICU runs and a family member's role in that. And that's really hard for somebody who their goal this afternoon was just to go to Target to get some extra Christmas gifts. And here they've been brought into a new situation after talking to police and going to an emergency room and now showing up in the ICU. And so part of my role, I see, is helping family members. I play the role sometimes of translating from a family member to a team and from the team to a family member, because I can spend more time maybe with a family member and hear more of their context and understand more of their native vocabulary. So I can help maybe re-describe what they're hearing from the team, and then I can also help the team understand from a different perspective what the family member is really trying to say, but maybe doesn't feel safe saying out loud. So that translation piece is a really, I think that's a really important piece, but it's also an opportunity to sit with somebody with a different agenda, but with my agenda being really intentionally trying to understand who they are and what they're going through right now, and without necessarily trying to accomplish a decision or a code status change, but trying to honor who they are as an individual and honor all of the chaos and anger and grief that they've been through in the last whatever short amount of time, and trying to respect their personhood and their personally understood native spirituality, and then trying to help them find a way to make sense of that in this really unusual, really weird context, so that the family member can have the most respectful and dignified end or life or whatever that they have the opportunity to have, and so that also the people that are making decisions can feel like they have been respected as much as possible through the process. So I'm excited.
So thank you all. It's great to be the non-chaplain, my chaplain colleague. I think this case actually exemplifies the interconnection between spiritual distress and suffering and the ethical issues that we find ourselves sort of confronting. And my favorite definition of suffering is one that Warren Wright, who's a theologian, actually wrote about many years ago, as suffering is anguish experienced as a threat to our composure, to our integrity, to the fulfillment of our intentions, to the concrete meaning of who we are. And I think this case actually highlights that. And at the same time, I think there's a thread of moral suffering in this as well, because moral suffering is that anguish that is in response to some kind of moral adversity, sense of moral failure or doing something wrong. And as you sort of listen to her narrative, perceiving that, not agreeing to the continuation of life-sustaining therapy might be considered a moral wrong in her framework. And so I think underneath all of that is really the core question of how can this daughter find integrity in the midst of this complex situation. And you can imagine what that might look like. So there's the integrity that she has with her faith, but there's also the integrity with the values and commitments that she perceives that go along with her role as a daughter. How can I, at the end of this, see myself as a good person? How can I see myself as being a good daughter? What would a good daughter do in this circumstance? And you can sort of hear that struggle of finding a place of wholeness in the midst of really probably a lot of dissonance for her, trying to make sense out of a situation that has a lot of conflicting elements to it, trying to figure out, how do I respond now that I've been alienated from my father and now I'm in a role where I actually could demonstrate my love and care of him in this, really challenging situation where I have to make a choice that will influence the timing and circumstance of his death. And you can also imagine that with that, there's a heavy weight of feeling that our decisions actually are determining the outcome, which in this case, I think it's pretty clear that the condition that her father was in really had already been determined, that it was really just a question of how, as you pointed out, how those last moments were going to unfold. So there's, I think, a lot at stake, and I think this is where our ethical frameworks and our ways of thinking about ethics move from being theoretical into the actual lived experience of how people have to navigate tough choices. And in many ways, we can't change the outcome for her father, but we do have an opportunity to change the way that she is able to move on after his death. And that may be, in many ways, where our attention needs to be of how do we actually create the conditions so she is able to go on. And at the same time, as we sort of alluded to, I can imagine the clinical team taking care of this gentleman, feeling a lot of moral distress themselves, of not wanting to cause more harm or suffering physically or emotionally for him, wanting to fulfill their obligations as clinicians, to be a good doctor, a good nurse, to make the right decisions, to fulfill our responsibilities to advocate for the interests of the patient. And so we come together in this condition where everyone is really suffering, and how we then navigate that and prioritize how we are going to respond to each stakeholder's version of suffering in the midst of these really challenging situations. And I do think that's where there's an opportunity to expand our own repertoire, but also to think about what resources are available. So our consult service can provide some assistance in addressing some of those moral questions, but clearly having our chaplains be a part of that can often bring those elements together in a way that can lead to better outcomes rather than intensifying the distress and the suffering that everyone is experiencing.
Can I respond to that? Yeah. Something that you said, Cinder, reminded me, and I'm not going to remember this, so somebody's going to have to help me, but the sort of standard, for those of you who are working with adults, who often work with adults who are dying, what are the standard things that people need to hear, like you need to hear that you're loved, you need to hear, Mark does this, what is it, come on. I love you, I forgive you, thank you, and everybody else is going to be okay, right? So we see a new situation that rolls in our unit. And we kind of have, often it's a fairly clear picture. We kind of know how this is going to end. And we sort of, in our different roles, slide into a script. And this was as Brittany was doing, we slide into a script. We kind of know, the time frame might change a little bit, but we kind of know the stuff that's going to need to be accomplished. And we have to re-enter that every time. We have to re-enter that every time as a new situation for them, even though we kind of know how the road is shaped. They've never been on the road before. And we have that responsibility of playing that guide role too. And that's some of the chaplain's role, but everybody gets to play a part in this. And I think that that's such a vital, and again, as Cindy was saying, it's helping to shape how this young woman is going to be living the rest of her life on the other side of however this ends. And we have an opportunity to help affect that, even though maybe they're only with us for a few days and we only have a few hours of interaction. These people who are going through situations like this, they're remembering some version of every interaction that they had. And so we have the opportunity to shape messaging that a person is going to be taking with them as they go forward.
Can I just point out something? I also want to point out how important it is to call us on the front end so that we can establish a relationship with the patient and the family. It's very good. We do appreciate you calling us right at the very end because we're needed. This is what we do. But if you called us on the front end, then we're able to establish a relationship and possibly get to an answer quicker or a resolve faster because we've already established a relationship with the family, and then we can speak with you as well, and then somehow meet in the middle. So.
And I want to give credit to that for the NCCU, and I wanted to also give credit to those who are with us from the NCCU today who have assisted with this case. Renita, our social worker on the NCCU, as well as Sharita, who's a CCR, and Carissa is with us, who's had 13 years of experience as an NCCU nurse. So I thank you for you guys coming and supporting, and they have their also some input to this as well.
Yeah, actually, that was the point that I was going to make too about the preemptive referral, because I do think it mattered in this case that the chaplain had already established some rapport, so that phone call that comes there's a face that's associated, there's a voice, it's not a totally cold call. And the weight of the story related to her family and what she had to go through, I don't know what that felt like, imagining her having to go toe-to-toe with her aunt behind the scenes, what that looked like in the house. We didn't get to see any of that. And then what was the fallout of the family? Yes, she got to become the medical decision maker, but at what cost? And how do all those factors contribute to her staying away from the hospital for a period of time in her own story? But then the story of the medical team is, where is she? And so you have two competing stories, and always the danger is that you're only remembering or staying connected to only one of those stories, and you're not making room for an alternative version or for someone else's story.
So this, I think, is a really interesting point. One of the strategies for addressing suffering is what's called narrative repair. And so in a way you sort of illustrated giving her a counter story, another way to see the situation and to see herself and her agency in the context of, a narrative that she had already created that left her feeling as if she was having to make a sort of a incomprehensible choice, because there was no place for her to find integrity in the midst of that. And so sometimes the narrative repair is providing that alternative counter story. And often, even when we're doing consults and other situations, to say, we have all done our best to try to address the disease or the injury, and it hasn't worked. And so, that process is unfolding no matter what we do. So the choice really is not life or death. It's really about how one will live until they die. And that can sometimes help people to not feel that they're carrying that weight. And to sort of normalize how much control we do and don't have in these situations, which, more and more I feel like we have less and less, even though we like to pretend like we have a lot over everything that is in front of us. But I think that counter story and narrative repair can also be a really important element of offering a way for people to work with their suffering.
One more thing comes to mind as you were talking. We have a seasoned chaplain. Well, we have a few seasoned chaplains, but Rhonda Cooper, Rhonda Cooper, I was having a conversation with her around just this. And so let's say that this patient had an advance directive, and the person, the power of attorney, was still struggling with making the ultimate decision. And Rhonda said it's really just a heart issue. They chose you with their heart a while ago. And so it's not really, the burden doesn't fall on the patient that makes the decision, but it was already someone that, I trusted with my life. And so it's really not your decision, they made the decision for you. And so I just thought that was so, I was like, wow, Rhonda. She said, yeah, after years of doing it, you kind of just figure it out, right? So I thought I should share that with clinicians as well. Hey, Rhonda.
Well, this time it may be good to segue into some questions. So we can take a few questions for our panel.
I don't know whether it would help or hurt for me to have some definitions of spirituality. You've been using the term spirituality. Physicians aren't in medical school taught about spirituality. I don't have a definition that I've been taught over the years. And I'm wondering, when you talk about this particular case, some of you seem to be using the term spirituality, and some of you not. Would it be helpful for us as physicians to know what spirituality is, the way you're using it, or does that hurt our looking at this case?
So I would begin, but what I love about spirituality is that it takes on so many diverse meanings. And so in our department, we have so many diverse cultures and backgrounds. So I can speak it from what I, as a millennial, also would view spirituality from that context. So for me, as also as a clinician, how I see spirituality is someone who doesn't necessarily fit or somewhat. It's not in an organization, you're not in a religious dogma, but it is a view in which you believe that there is some sort of higher power. There is some sense of power in this world in which you cannot name, but you know it exists. So instead of saying you belong to a certain faith background, you have some spiritual setting, some grounding in which you call your own. But that would be my own definition.
So I'm not going to remember this well, and you're noticing my memory stinks. The palliative care statement in 2002 defined spirituality as the framework that a person uses to make a connection to things greater than themselves. And so I know a lot of you are looking and saying, well, that's pretty broad. Yeah, it's pretty broad. And what it's intended to include is people who are officially Roman Catholic, and also people who find a connection to a higher power by sitting next to a water. Right? Like spirituality is a super broad, super diverse concept. And part of what we end up doing, and sometimes there can be, it's not conflict, but we end up rubbing up against other disciplines. Because part of what we end up doing is trying to assess and understand how this person makes sense of the world. And what framework are they using to make meaning? Because some people come in waving a particular religious flag. And it's so easy, right? When somebody comes in and says, oh, I was born Episcopal and I'm going to die Episcopal. I can go to our friends on the internet and ask them what an Episcopal believes about death. And that helps so much. But when a person comes in and says, I really have never been to church that much, I don't know exactly what I believe, but I know that my mom is really with me and she's been dead for 20 years. So then I got to spend more time, do a little bit more of a creative interpretation investigation of trying to understand who this individual is in front of me and how it is they're going to make decisions, how they want information, how it is that, what are the things that are important to them about how they're going to, if it's an end-of-life situation, about how they're going to approach it. So for me, the more I do this, the more emphasis I have on the individual context of the person in front of me. Because even if I had a family that they all, they've got 6 adult children and they're all trying to make a decision about their father and the end of his life, and they all say, we've been Catholic our entire lives. You're going to get, at a minimum, 6 different interpretations of Catholicism. Maybe 7, depending on the personalities in the room. And so we have to really pay attention to who's in front of us, and the dynamics that are working in the family, and the dynamics that are working in the individual.
I think the only thing I would add is that we would, again, want to make a quick assumption based on someone's faith letters that are listed in EPIC, that we know exactly how this person believes and what they end up doing, and would decide that we would still want to unearth, if we can, through a conversation about what's most meaningful. So I think it's a framework for making meaning, but it's also a framework for a relationship that is sometimes difficult to define, but you feel it. You feel it. And you feel it most during times of unrest or distress, which is why I think chaplains have jobs. Because we're here to meet in those places and nurture those places where during a health crisis, these types of reflections are very important and powerful. Thank you, Dan.
One of the things that also reminds me of is some of you have experienced the frustration of having an ethics consult happen with a particular patient of yours, and we leave recommendations that say it would be ethically permissible to do A, or it would also be ethically permissible to do the opposite of A. And you go, well, what are we supposed to do, right? But that option of either doing A or the opposite of A is based on the values of the individual, the values of the family, and the context that they're living in. Gratefully, most of the time it's more clear than that, but sometimes that's how it ends up, and it's based on how these people are approaching it. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Thank you. Very interesting discussion. I'm struck by the words narrative repair, and it made me think about institutions like Hopkins, University of Maryland, big institutions in general are mistrusted by a lot of the people in the communities around here. And I wondered how much that figured when you talk about pulling the plug. Families may say, oh, they're trying to save money, or they have some secondary gain from pulling the plug. How often does this enter into your thinking and your conversation with families about reestablishing, repairing that narrative of mistrust in these conversations that you have?
I think all of us are nodding our heads.
Yeah.
And I'm thankful for that word, the uses of that word, narrative repair, because that's exactly what took place in this case. It was maybe 6 encounters that I probably had told, including with the staff that was involved. But specifically with her, there were 3 encounters. And that second encounter, in which after she had the conversation with the clinician, I was able to come back in and literally repair the relationship from the distrust that she had with the physician, or just the distrust like what you just named as it relates to this hospital. Especially in the African American community in Baltimore, it is true that there is some form of rebuilding that you have to do in order for them to trust that they're actually going to take care of their loved one. And I don't know if that's always bringing in the heads of everyone that's involved, but I know as a chaplain that is something that is in my heart, and imprinted in my heart, that we are coming in somewhat on the social aspect, repairing the narrative of this institution. So thank you for that question.
I think I've heard that statement quite a few times. I'm not from here, and so I had to learn the history of Hopkins, and you hear it very clear from patients and families. And what I have moved to do is not necessarily convince, but let the family know that we're working as a team, a whole team, to do what's best for the patient at this time. And so we have conversations around what physicians are saying, what nurses are doing. And so I just continue to let them know that we're here as an entire team working together to make sure that the patient is taken care of mentally and physically, emotionally, and spiritually. That we all have a role, even the social work, we all have a role, and we're just trying to make sure that the patient is getting the best care possible.
So I think that question is often embedded in many of the cases that we're involved in. And I think that there's opportunities to be proactive in exploring that, but also thinking about the ways in which we might be able to communicate our commitment to that person, as you're saying, but also I think people sometimes listen for reassurance that we're not deviating from the way that we're treating every other patient here, and that you know, these kinds of questions would come up for any person that was in this circumstance, so that we can kind of give it a context that this is not, you know, an unusual path that we would find ourselves with, whether the person had a different context or, you know, background. And I think sometimes that can be helpful as well to kind of be more proactive in addressing what might be unsaid, but is clearly on the minds of the people we're taking care of.
And to the credit, I just want to say NCCU, to really, what they have done, I think, is open up these family meetings and created a space so where the entire interdisciplinary team is working with the family. I think it is what happened when this clinician stepped out of that particular format in which where the trouble may have came up, but as far as how they actually have the format laid out where each member is a part of the family meeting. After the family meeting, there is a debrief, especially if there's a challenging case with, again, with just the clinicians involved indicated. And then we come back and say what didn't work, and then come back into the family meeting again. So I think they have laid out their proactive plan on the NCCU clinic, at least I know. I think it's when it was deviated that it was
I think it's really hard work, just to say it out loud. And it's not something that we can do really fast. It requires you to pause and to think, sometimes pause and think again before you move to action. I think about this case and the phone call that was made, and imagining, but not knowing exactly what was going on the unit that day, but what is the goal here? The goal was to try and convince someone who hasn't been in the hospital for 3 days to come and make a significant decision. And I don't know what the voice tone was like and all those things, but I think the end result is that there's an increase in mistrust. And to pretend that race didn't play a part, I think would be a mistake. So what are the narratives here, and how do we pause and really think through an effective strategy that would take into account all the feelings that potentially are there? And that's hard work. On a fast-paced unit, it's hard work. But I think in the end, you're saving more time in the long run when you're able to pause and to really think about, well, what are the stories, what are the different narratives involved here? And the severity of this case and the quickness of this person's accident coming on into our hospital. And I think part of the story, too, was that the daughter had reestablished some relationship with her father within the last month, figuring out he had reached sobriety, and then he had either a relapse or I'm not sure, but there was something, and then there was this accident. And so that's also part of the story. So how do we, again, pause and do that work? It's a challenge. Other questions?
Just in lieu of another question, I just want to, the thing that I was thinking of that you said much more eloquently is that it's not accidentally successful. When situations like this go well, it's not because we all just happen to be good people and showed up at the same time. It takes so much intentional effort to pay attention to our own role, class, race, place in the society. I'm wearing a name badge, you're not. Like just paying attention to all those things have to be a part of it. Because there's so, like, when you look at the lobby, the world walks through it, and it's every class, every race, every country, ethnicity, everybody comes in here, and we have to work at that every time. And each situation is in context.
Yeah, and I think one of the nice things that chaplains do, certainly in training, I think our students wouldn't call it nice, but they're really encouraged to reflect on who you are as a person trying to provide care. So what is your own personal story? Where are your biases? Where are your trigger buttons, so to speak? Why is this patient reminding you of your mother, who you haven't talked to in 10 years, or your little brother who you love without end? So you have these pushes and pulls on the inside. Again, unless you stop and pause, you may not know, and we're working on this automatic pilot. So when we encounter, certainly as a chaplain, you don't have things to do to a patient minus try to listen with your best ears, hear what they're saying, and reflect back in a very, hopefully, supportive manner to understand their story and what is really on their mind and heart in that moment, in that encounter. And in order to do that effectively, you do have to know your own story. As Brittany, I think, also outlined, in her own story, she was aware of the places of connection and was able to utilize that in a positive manner. Whereas if she had not acknowledged her story, that outcome may have gone a couple of different directions. So we can really start to pick it apart a little bit. But in knowing oneself can be very, again, that's the journey of life in some way. We're all trying to get to a place where we know how we come across and what is inside of us and our stories and how that affects others. But we're in a helping relationship, we're in a helping field, healing field. It becomes even more paramount to understand these stories. All right, do we have time for one more question? Well, if no other questions, thank you all very much. Again, happy holidays. Thank you for having us.